Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for this conversation with Swetha Totapally on creating a gender equitable world.
Gender inequality still hurts us everywhere, is my genuine and honest answer. It's not like we've won the battle.
Swetha is the regional director for Dalberg Asia Pacific. Over her 13-year career at Dalberg, Swetha has led the firm's global gender practice and developed a portfolio focused on addressing issues such as violence against women and girls, sexual exploitation, and unpaid care work.
Violence against women and girls, or violence against people who identify as a third gender, or people who identify as a sexual minority, right?
Swetha brings a unique and informed perspective around what it takes to create a more equitable world for women at all levels, at the societal level, at an organizational level, and of course, as an individual, as a woman leader, a mother, and a wife. And it's important to look at change across all of these levels because that is what it will take for us to reimagine and create a world that works for everyone, especially women. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Conscious Woman podcast. This is your host, Bhavna Toor. Our goal with this podcast is to bring you interesting and insightful conversations on a range of topics that will support you in both living and leading more consciously. From conscious leadership and conscious inclusion to conscious eating, conscious parenting, and conscious fashion. This podcast is in conjunction with the leadership development work that we do to support women leaders in leading with mindfulness and compassion. To learn more, please go to shenomics.com. Hi, Swetha. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I'm so happy finally I get a chance to speak to you. This is wonderful. So thank you.
And thanks to you, Bhavna. I'm so glad that we're able to speak today.
Wonderful. So, Swetha, one thing that I've noticed in the arc of your career is you are for sure a staunch advocate for gender equality. And through the various things that you've done over the course of your career, you've really advocated for gender equality in a variety of different ways. And I'd be curious to know what informs this passion, especially if we look back to your early experiences and your life overall. What has informed this passion and this vision of yours?
Thanks, Bhavna. I guess for me, at some point, I really realized that the personal is political. It's obvious now, but in my childhood, it wasn't. And I think what I experienced and saw in my childhood, both at the level of myself as an individual, but also in the context of my family, were deep inequities that just kind of seemed like day to day and almost taken for granted. And if you tried to erase them, it would just be the question of why are you even talking about it? And some things, of course, were also like in many families, I had my own family equivalent of monsoon wedding, things that happen that are really disturbing, but are also just covered up. And growing up, I think I just felt like that's just me. That's just my family. It's very personal. We keep it kind of closeted. I think when I went to college, there was this latent interest that I explored through some of my coursework, but it always stayed in that personal realm. And at that time, when I was in university, the term feminism was still somewhat vilified, actually, right? It was the language back then was like, if you're a feminist, you're a feminazi. I think that has begun to change, not fully as much as I would like to in the last 15 years or so, but that was the culture in which I grew up. And then when I came into the professional workforce, it was like a very different hat, right? It was, work is very serious. You're focused on the economy. I was an investment banker in my first job. Even when I came to Dalberg, I felt like I was working on issues that were really connected to the markets, financial inclusion, digitization. And it was only after a few years after being here at Dalberg that I think I really saw how linked issues around gender equity are to our markets, to our politics, to all of society. And actually, it's our mainstream language that kind of has it wrong, right? So often we talk about GDP and GDP growth, but for the purpose of whom? And for, to what end? And really it should be for the purposes of people and for families. And the moment you start thinking about economic growth in that light, in that context, it completely changes, your vantage point and how you think about solutions. I think that's the learning that I've kind of come into over my time, over the last decade or so. And then I think the other thing that I would say is that, you have no solutions. You don't have a great society if you're not solving for half of humanity. And women and girls are half of humanity. And so it's impossible for any of us, especially in our line of work at Dalberg, to do our work well without taking into account gender equality.
Yeah, so true. So true. I think all the points that you shared are so valid. The personal is political. And yes, women do take up half the sky. So how can we really forge a better path ahead for all of humanity without factoring in how it impacts women? And if it does indeed create equitable outcomes for all genders. I'm curious, Swetha, when you look at your work in social impact and in other areas that you're focusing on, where are you seeing gender equality is still a serious concern? And where is it still hurting us? So what would you say are the top areas?
That's a good question. Look, I would say gender inequality still hurts us everywhere, is my genuine and honest answer. It's not like we've won the battle anywhere, whether it's in terms of our bodily rights, our place in the, our space in the workplace, our representation and power in governments. And so I think we have long ways to go in all spaces. And I think that, we're also in a particularly painful time right now, where in many geographies and contexts, rights are being rolled back. But the thing that I would say maybe as a more direct answer to your question, I think there's at least one area that is very severely overlooked, even in the context of all that has been done for gender equality over the last several decades. And that, I would say, is violence, gender-based violence. Whether it's violence against women and girls, or violence against people who identify as a third gender, or people who identify as a sexual minority, right? And that is pervasive. It affects, by conservative estimates, more than a third of people, or a third of women all over the world, and in some countries even more. And most people think that's an underestimate. Usually it's the violence perpetuated by intimate partners. So basically the people that we live with. And it's something that kind of gets overlooked in most circles, whether government circles or foundation circles. And it's usually overlooked because it's just it's considered, I think, really hard to deal with. It goes back to, well, this feels like a personal space. This feels like it's normative. What can we do about these issues? And I think people find it just really hard to deal with, and therefore kind of put blinders on. Actually, it's one of those things that impacts our ability to achieve our societal goals, whether it's girls' education, improved maternal health and mortality, whether it's higher and better economic outcomes for families. Gender-based violence affects all of it.
Yes. And the scale of gender-based violence is so vast. It's almost shocking. I believe a recent statistic that I read was that the number of women, if you look at the number of women who have experienced some form of violence or harassment, even sexual or otherwise, that number could be as high as 80%. Just that number is just so staggering. So Swetha, given how vast this problem is, and as you mentioned, it impacts so many other goals and objectives we would have for women, whether it's in the areas of education or livelihoods or anything that would help create more equitable outcomes for women. What would you propose, or what have you seen are potential solutions to minimizing the scale of gender-based violence for women?
Thanks, Bhavna. It's a good question. And I would start by just saying, I think eliminating gender-based violence creates a more equitable world, not just for women and girls, but for all of us. And that's part of the misnomer, right? We think we end violence just for the women and girls. And of course, we absolutely must. And it's our humanly right to live without the fear of our own physical safety day in and day out. But I think it also contributes to a better, safer, happier world for all of us, all of those who live with us as well and are around us as well. And look, there's a lot of work that's been done on how to eliminate violence against women and girls. We actually wrote a piece called The Imperative to Invest a couple of years ago that looked very closely at, what works to end violence against women and girls. And there's a whole rich body of evidence collected over the last 30, 40 years by academics. And we actually showed the links between implementing those solutions and how to achieve societal goals, especially around the SDGs. And I think there's maybe 4 or 5 things that can really come through about what matters. And it's one of those things where it's good news, actually, because that there are solutions that work despite the perception that this is just an intractable, stubborn problem, right? And what we've learned about what it takes is it takes a comprehensive set of solutions that work across all aspects of society. Everything from policies to services for women and girls to interventions in schools, all of the engagement with civil society, all of those things make a really big difference. And I think it starts with, how does government think about financing, right? Where is the money even going? And to what extent and how does it address GBV? Or to what extent does it even perpetuate GBV, right? We have to think about how policy around, military action has direct influence on the amount of violence that occurs, that women and girls experience day in and day out. Every time you wage war, there is violence against women and girls, right? And so that is perhaps one of the most overlooked and perhaps biggest levers of change is actually what is our military spend and what is our approach and thinking around military policy. And, I think there's some statistics that actually show that the amount of violence against women and girls that happens in a given year, more losses to life due to that than losses to life due to war, actually. So the comparison's not perfect. Obviously, women and girls are lost in the context of war, et cetera, as well. But it tells you the scale of the problem and also highlights the scale of the differential spend in terms of the solutions as well. We know how staggering military budgets are globally. At the policy layer, there's things that, again, people kind of overlook. It's not just about what happens, when you have been abused, but it's also things like what constitutes rape in a country context. So what is rape law? What is family law? Is rape in the family context even considered rape? Those are all things that have really are treated very differently from country to country, that have a really outsized impact in terms of the justice that women are able to achieve in the country context. Then, of course, there's a question of what is that service layer and service provision, right? So, do you have access to contraceptives, right? And sexual reproductive solutions? In the case that you do experience some kind of assault or abuse, what are the helplines and hotlines that you're able to access? How reliable are they? What is the quality with which you are able to access those services? Are there domestic shelters in place that you can go to in case you need safety? That really matters. The question of how, the legislative system and the judicial system come together really, really matter, especially in the South Asian context, right? Where I think one of the things that, in case women actually do speak up here, oftentimes it's the police themselves, the question, women's morality and what did women do something wrong in the first place, right? And so unless you address kind of how are these particular aspects of our systems engage with women, you're not going to achieve, create safety for people to actually speak up. And then, when you talk about our civil society and that vibrant and active civil society, those are often the people who engage with women day in and day out, right? And they're also the people who are changing and working on engaging norms of boys and men, of often mother-in-laws and families working in school, the school system and outside of the school system to drive that change. And that really matters as well. And so that's why I say, it's a whole of society approach. It's a comprehensive approach that really matters. We've seen that it works, and it also works when you do it together and more effectively than when you do any of these individual types of interventions one-on-one, right? So it is more effective when you put these things together than just say a deeper focus on policies or just a deep focus on laws. Kind of need the whole package, as with most things that require societal change.
Yeah. So when we look at the hope for a more gender equitable world, at least if you look at what the World Economic Forum puts out, I believe the number is still that we're close to over 130 years away from full gender parity. So we're not going to see it in our lives. Our daughters may not even witness full gender parity. We're looking at a few generations out. What do you believe how can we accelerate this process? Because 130 is a big number. So do you think there's a way to accelerate this process? Like how do you look at that?
Well, I sure as hell hope so. For all of us, for our next generations, in this moment, it feels very difficult because of the global political climate that we're in. I'm going to be really honest and just saying that. And to me, I think the biggest shift that we need, maybe two. One is a shift in political will, which all of us know. And that's what, feminists and activists around the world fight day in and day out for. And it requires, for them to be effective, much greater funding, much greater mobilization to be able to effectively, fight against. I don't use the word lightly in this conversation, fighting, right? But to fight against anti-rights actors. I think the second thing is, I don't know how controversial this is, but I think we need to move away from capitalism as a solution to gender equality. And so what I mean by that is that so much of the discourse around how to drive gender equality, at least in mainstream spaces, I'm not saying in activist spaces or even feminist spaces, but has been around bringing women into the workplace, giving them their right to work, which again is like really, really important. I'm completely supportive of women's choice and agency and their participation in the economic sphere of our world. But I think it has come at a cost of looking at the other aspects that also need to fall in place at the same time. And so, what does care infrastructure look like? How are we thinking about valuing care and care work in the first place? How do we think about violence and basic rights and safety? And all of these things are really intertwined. And so because we've had this, I think I would argue, the somewhat narrow focus on let's bring women into the workplace. And that's a solution that kind of feels happily acceptable to most of us. And again, it's a pretty controversial in many parts of the world still. I don't think we're able to make progress on these other pieces that you really need simultaneously. What rights in the workplace if you're not safe at home or safe at work? What does it mean to be empowered in the workplace if you're also navigating all of the shifts at home, right? Whether it's cooking or caring for children or caring for the elderly generation. And so I want to be able to win those arguments and make progress on those fights at the same time. But I also in some ways think those are precursors to our women's ability to, our collective ability to make progress on some of these other fronts as well.
Yeah. And segueing into that, because yes, on one hand, we can look at gender inequality at a societal level, but bringing it down to our day-to-day reality, looking at the workplace, while it's not the only solution, especially as you said, if we only look at simply bringing women to work in the absence of other things that can support them, it's not going to be the answer. But just looking at the fact that it is for many of us who are working, are a large part of our experience, our day-to-day experience gets shaped in the workplace.
Of course.
I'd love to know what you, Swetha, how you are approaching creating an equitable workplace, because I know you are doing you have quite a few initiatives in place to ensure that irrespective of whatever may be happening outside of work, that at least when that woman is in the workplace, she's treated fairly and equitably. So I'd love to hear more about that, because I think there could be a lot to learn from that for other leaders and other decision makers as well, in terms of what they could consider as far as the workplace is concerned.
Sure, I can give it a shot. And I would say, for most organizations, it's a work in progress for us as well. And we're learning as we're going. I think some of the most powerful things for us as an organization, there's things that we do internally, and then I think there's things that we do in the context of our work, both of which I think matter. When you think about what matters in the workplace, at the end of the day, what are people looking for out of a work experience? They're looking for challenge. They're looking for great opportunities. They're looking for purpose. They're looking for camaraderie and belonging, and I think that is probably the first and foremost. Are we giving people good, meaningful work and growth opportunities, no matter who they are. That's kind of the core and the foundation of it. And I think one of the things that I at least feel proud of about who we are as an organization at Dahlberg, I think that we feel like we do really meaningful work because the sole purpose of our company, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it yet, we're advisors, we're consultants, we're strategy advisors, but our sole mission is to help our clients optimize for social impact, which means that all of the work that we do is optimizing for the benefit of people on our planet. And that by nature, I think, has a lot of purpose and meaning built into it. So I think that's kind of the first and foremost thing, which is like, what is the business and what is the business model? Then there's the question of, what are the policies and practices and behaviors that we have in place within the organization? As an organization in general, we prioritize flexibility. And, this is, of course, a difficult topic in the context of post-COVID. We've been trying to strike the balance alongside everyone else. We're currently at 3 days a week back in office and 2 days a week, kind of work from home. It's an office first policy, but it gives you the flexibility of being where you need to when you need to, by and large. I think we also really have focused on, especially when people become parents, which is one of those inflection points, right? For people in the workplace, we have tried to prioritize flexibility in leaving and flexibility for coming back, really in terms of individualized plans, et cetera, with no impact to your professional career, your trajectory. And in some senses, I'm a case in point for that, right? I've been on our management team for the last 7 years. In the last 4.5 or 5 years, I've had 3 children, including one in the last year. And I was asked to be a regional director at the same time that I was pregnant with my 3rd child. And no one questioned, my ability to play this role in the context of having 3 very, very young children, and certainly even being pregnant, right? And I think that is still pretty rare in this world. There's a third thing that I would say that's linked as well to kind of parents and parenting, which is around, how we even talk about our policies and who they're for. So by and large in India, we have a maternity leave policy, right? The 6-month maternity bill. There's not really provision for paternal leave. And the way that we talk about our parental leave policy, it's parental leave, right? Whether you are a woman, a man, or identify as a third gender. And so that is kind of the context of how we think about our parental leave. And, you have the right to choose what kind of caregiver you want to be, whether you're the primary caregiver or the secondary caregiver. And so in that sense, we are trying to demonstrate also and encourage more men to be active caregivers in the workplace. And one of the things I'm most proud about is that actually quite a few of the men in our office actually take long parental leaves and demonstrate what it means to be shifting gender norms at home as well. And then beyond that, within the workplace, it's from again, back to the basics, right? How do you do performance management and reviews? How deeply are you looking at gender parity across levels of the organization? Where does the decision-making sit? And, we're really diligent and pretty vigilant also about making sure that we're tracking our gender parity across all of our levels, especially within our senior management. We look at recruiting very closely from that perspective. And then when you look across our senior management team, whether on the consulting side or also on our operations side, we have lots of women represented in our senior leadership. And so we take a lot of efforts and care around that to make sure that we're where we want to be as an organization. Mm-hmm. And then I would say the last piece is to, I bring it back to the content of our work. I talked about at the beginning of are you providing purposeful work? I would say the content of our work, quite a lot of it is specifically focused on gender equality, right? Not just at Dahlberg, but outside of Dahlberg. And that's where we've been able to push the needle on some of the issues that we've been talking about, right? Violence against women and girls, the value of unpaid care work in society. What does it mean to bring women, to support women into the labor force, support women's entry into the labor force in a way that actually is supportive of the context of their whole lives? How do you think about institutional change, no matter what kind of institution, to be designed for gender transformative outcomes? It represents a really big and core part of our portfolio. And I think that's also another way in which we're shaping gender equitable outcomes in terms of who we are as an organization.
Yeah, those are some really impactful measures. And if I was to just look at the research around what does help create equitable workplaces for women, I would say you're really addressing a lot of those points, because especially flexibility. I think a recent study that I read said it still is among the top 3 preferences for women when they are choosing the right organization for themselves. And as many as 80% of women leave if there is lack of flexibility. Even your point about encouraging men to become caregivers is such an important point, because you can have the right maternity policies in place, but if we're not also encouraging men to step up as equal partners and caregivers, then we're simply perpetuating the status quo that it's the woman's responsibility.
Exactly.
On that note, and switching gears to the personal domain, because as you said, we can't only look at the workplace, and there's only so much we can do in the workplace. We also have to be mindful and supportive of creating this kind of equality outside of work as well, especially in our homes. And to this point of encouraging men to step up as equal partners and equal caregivers, what's been your experience? Like, how have you been able to do that in your own personal life?
Yeah, my husband and I, so we've been married, I guess it's been 8 years. It was 8 years a couple of days ago. We have spent a lot of time talking and working through this. And in many ways, to be honest, it was inspired by some of the work that I've done in the Dalberg context. I think it was, 7 or 8 years ago, I was doing some work on unpaid care work in the context of America. And I remember reading Unfinished Business by Anne-Marie Slaughter. And then it prompted like a whole slew of conversations at home. We didn't have kids at the time, right? Of like, how do we think about structuring our time? Who does what kind of work at home? What would it look like if we were to have children? And what does it mean to be supportive? Because both of us, are working professionals. What does it mean to be supportive for each other? And I remember in that period, we were given this really great piece of advice by one of Ashu's colleagues, who basically said this, many of us who are in working couple relationships aspire to 50-50, right? Not everyone will. Some people will, kind of prefer, men working and women spending less time at home. Some might flip the model altogether. And I see more and more examples of women being the primary breadwinners and men actually choosing to stay home and be with children and take care of other family responsibilities. But for many who are working couples to this day, I think 50-50 is kind of the model or ideal they aspire to. And the advice that she gave us was 50-50 is not a point in time. 50-50 is something that you achieve over the course of a lifetime. And so what that means is, there are moments where someone may step back for one person, another may step, and then 3 or 4 years later or 5 years later, then the roles reverse and you kind of make active choices around that. And I remember that being really important for us then, because when I moved back to India in 2018, that was a very conscious decision to say, okay, I should actually quit his job to enable me to come back to India and work for Dalberg, and he found a new job, right? So that was a really big moment for us. And then in that context, I was about to have our first child. So not only had he left his first job, we took 4 months of parental leave together, which again is not so common. I think even when men do get parental leave, often still people kind of stack their parental leaves to maximize the time off together, but we were able to take it together, which was a really lovely and rewarding experience for us. And then when we were going back to work, at that moment, we actually both came back at 3 days a week because we were optimizing, to your point, for flexibility for both of us spending time with our child, our oldest son now, Nayan. And so that was really important. But then as the years have progressed, I have kind of stepped more fully back into work. I'm back full time right now, especially in the current role that I've taken. And he's the one for the last 2 or 3 years has continued to be part-time over the years. And that takes sacrifice. That's not easy in this world. And so that is one of the biggest things that we have had to navigate and discuss over and over again over the last several years. And I'm really grateful that he has helped both of us defy gender norms, because I don't think it's easy to do that. And then the second thing that I would say is that it also takes a lot of other structures to fall in place, right? And in India, especially, where there's a lot of domestic workers and staff, they play also a really outsized and often invisible role in enabling working mothers or working parents in general to live their working lives. And I guess the reason I highlight them is because so often we're used to describing them as help. Often they're actually like our staff. Often they're really quite underpaid. It is that particular inequity, right, that enables us to be thriving working professionals. And I think there's a hard look that we need to take also as society in terms of how do we value them? What are the rights that they have, right? Especially in a place like India where their work is almost entirely informal. The rights are few. Many of them are working 24/7 or often at best 6 days a week. And their salaries are for many minimum wage, but minimum wage is not really living wage in this context. And so in some ways, it's also a call to remember and recognize actually our professional success is on the backs of other people who are doing our care work alongside and for us. And we have a responsibility back to them in terms of how we think about paying them, which I personally think needs to be better than what is our current status quo.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And for me as well, personally, I realized this, the true sacrifice that even the women who are supporting us as our domestic staff, the sacrifices they are making. I remember when I was leaving India to move to Singapore, my helper who essentially helped us raise my son as we were leaving, she said, you know what, I have to say something to you. My children have always been very jealous of your son. And I'm like, really? Why is that? And she's like, because for the last few years, they believe I've spent more time and more of my energy taking care of your son than I have of them.
Yeah.
And until she said that, Swetha, it never occurred to me that, wow, yeah, she's actually making a huge personal sacrifice to help me. And had she not helped me, for all of us working women, if we didn't have this kind of support, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. So you're right. I think we can't ignore the plight of these women. And as you said, in India, I mean, it's still largely informal. They still don't have a lot of the rights and policies in place to really support them as well. So I'm so glad you raised that point. And equally, I think what you said about creating that 50-50 partnership with your partner, I think that's such a powerful point, that it's not on a day-to-day basis. If you look at it across the lifetime, then you realize, yeah, it's okay. At some point, your partner may take the lead and maybe you step back. At some point you take the lead and, he steps back. It's okay. I mean, we all have to do our part, as long as we're doing our part to really make the whole thing work. So, Swetha, outside of that, that's of course a big, big piece, finding that equal partnership, finding that support system at home, whether it's through, our domestic staff or other family members. I mean, that's a big, big piece of the pie. Other than that, of course, I think as working women, if we're going to continue to support our ambition, we need to be very, hyper, I suppose, vigilant in how we prioritize our time and our energy, so that we are showing up fully for all the things that are important to us. So I'm curious, Swetha, what are a set of, let's say, daily practices or habits that you might have in place that support you in showing up fully as a leader that you are?
I would say maybe it's a couple of things. One, there's a macro thing, and then there's some day-to-day things, I think. One is, now that I've had 3 kids and have gone through parental leave and coming back to work 3 different times in a pretty short stretch, what I've learned is what I need really evolves every 5-6 months. And so, just kind of listening to my body and knowing when things feel off balance has actually been a really big part of it. And then adjusting how I work accordingly, right? So for some stretch 3 or 4 years ago, I was working half days every day for 5 days. Sometimes I took Fridays off. Sometimes I was like, okay, I'll, just clock off between 5 and 8 and then I'll sign back on. But then on the X days, I won't be online. And it changes every time, or it changes pretty often. But I think that has been part of the beauty of it, is like children change, our families change, we as individuals change, and therefore our needs change. And learning to recognize that has actually been really important for me in the last several years. On a more day-to-day basis, I would say there's some things just around structure that I've been experimenting with over the last year that have really helped. I'm a morning person and my best thinking is in the morning. And so I pretty religiously now block off like an hour and a half or two just to start my day with my deepest thinking work, so that I preserve like the writing time, the time to just like plan, the time to just take a step back. And then on Fridays, I try to do no meeting Fridays as well. So again, it creates like structural space for me to think and reflect and not to react. That's probably the biggest structural thing. The second thing is probably more from a behavioral perspective, which is I feel like we're so often just working in what feels like a very, very busy world. And I try not to make the time that I have with people feel busy. So for me, at least, busyness creates a sense of like anxiety, feels like a sense of stress, makes me feel like I'm not doing deep thinking. It makes me feel like I'm not really engaging with people that I want to, in the way that I want to, in the way that I show up. And so one of the things that I am working on is whether a conversation is 5 minutes or 2 hours, to focus on just being really fully present and not worrying about the clock. And that has helped me shift how I show up and engage and help focus on quality. And I don't know, those are probably the two biggest ones that I think maybe matter. The third one for me, I do a lot of work globally. And so it's always a practice of when do I take evening calls? When do I not? And just really focusing on nighttime rhythm and routine that's just stepping away from the office. That has become increasingly important over time. I think that we are for many of us in an always on work culture. And, the phone is always buzzing. There's always a text here and there. Something always feels urgent. And I have, for myself, discovered that actually what I really need to do is to be able to, most nights, I can't do it every night, is to actually just clock off fully when the kids are asleep and preserve just 1 or 2 hours that are completely away from the office. And so then between that and weekends, which are almost entirely off for me now, just because I can't have 3 kids and, they require care, that has gone a long way for me. And then the last thing that I would say, it's not a practice or anything, but I've tried to internalize learning to just love the ride. Every day has so many ups and downs. And there's, people give me good news every day. People give me really bad news every day. And I think I've just started to fall into a pattern where like, it's kind of fun and that's part of the play. And, when you're enjoying work, you feel happier and like a more balanced person. That's required for me a lot of work around compartmentalization. I'm not a natural compartmentalizer. This is like the first time in my entire professional career that I can say I've like started to learn to compartmentalize. But the compartmentalization, along with just kind of experiencing the highs and the lows and kind of like feeling it fully, I think has also just made a difference in terms of how I show up and how I feel day to day.
And that's a good segue into the next thing I'd love for you to share your thoughts on, which is, what supports you in living more consciously? Because, and what I mean by that is just living with a greater awareness of, at the end of the day, what's most important to you, and ensuring that you are, whether it's work or personally, that you are honoring, the priorities and values most important to you. And at the end of the day, you're able to end your day saying, yes, I'm proud of the way I'm living my life. So what for you, Swetha, at the end of the day, what gives you that peace of mind as your head hits the pillow? What gives you the sense of contentment to say, yes, this was a day lived well?
We don't always do it, but in our best moments, my husband and I, we have a practice of gratitudes. And so we just take a moment to reflect and chat about, we share back and forth. What are we grateful for from over the course of the day? It's something that we often do with our kids as they're falling asleep as well. And that is just a really nice reminder, right, of what is going right in the world, what is going right in our lives, how lucky we are in the context of everything that is happening all around us. And then the responsibility that we have to also help try to create a better world for those of us, for everyone around us as well. Right. And so I would say that's the one. And then we also take time, every 6 months or a year to step back and reflect more broadly. And then just to your point about consciousness, to consciously talk about, actually what are our values. We've at some point actually wrote them down as a family and have our top 10 values. We revisit what are the values that we really care about? How are we living according to those? Do the values need to be changed? What does that mean for the next couple of years in our lives, etc.? But the day-to-day is the small things, and then the big things is, actually planning the values and talking about them and deliberately making changes in our lives to help us live up to them.
Right. And speaking of values, I first of all, I love that you're looking at values not just individually, but as a family as well. That's really beautiful and powerful. Speaking of those values, what would you say are those for you? Because it looks like you do consciously step back and reflect on those. So if I was to ask you for these values, if there are, 2 or 3 things that you would want the world to remember you as or for, what would you say those values would be for you?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't know if I'm going to fully answer it for myself or the family, but it's some combination of those. Generosity is one that's really important to us. Generosity, especially when things get tough. Curiosity, and kind of just engaging with the world in an open-hearted way and wanting to learn from the experiences and the perspectives of others. And more so, probably because we have children and because they really infuse it, fun and play with the recognition of how important that is to living a balanced and meaningful life.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Swetha. Before we close this, I do want to make this actionable for anyone who's listening to this. So we started off talking about how important it is to create gender equality, not just for women, because it helps everyone at the end of the day. So in our individual capacity, anyone who's listening to this, what part can any one of us play, even if it's something small, that each of us can do in creating this gender equitable world that's better for everyone?
I think we can look at our own family structures and how we're operating as a family as a starting point, and as individuals in our own lives. And then, as a little unit and a little system within ourselves, and think about what are the changes that we want to make within that unit and for the next generation. That's probably the most tangible. And then I think in the broader systems that we engage with, right? So whether it is the workplace, and then when you see something, say something, I think observation is really, really powerful. Oftentimes you don't even know when a policy is inequitable or needs to be revised to create a better workplace. But then also within our community institutions and our governments, and asking more of the people who work to represent us as well. And so we have places to play in all of those spaces. I think it's a question of where each of us feels, number one, most comfortable, and number two, where we feel like we have the most agency to push the system a bit. And I would say that every single one of us has agency, whether we're women, whether we're girls, whether we're men, whether we're boys, whether we identify as their gender.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important point, that every one of us does have agency, and every one of us can do our bit to create this equal world for everyone. Swetha, thank you so much for this conversation today, and thank you for the work that you are doing, because it is very, very much needed for all of us in creating the kind of world, I think, for all of us, as well as our future generations, the kind of world that we hope they can also thrive in. So thank you so much, and I wish you all the best as you continue to do this.
And thanks back at you, Bhavna. I so appreciate the way in which you look at leadership. It's a very feminist approach to leadership. And I love the way in which you have conversations with people about how to be better leaders and more empathetic leaders and really bring their full authentic selves. And I think that's something that, women and feminists do really well. And I'm excited to see more of that shaping our world. So thanks back at you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found the conversation to be insightful. If you did, please do leave us a review, as that would be most helpful in helping others discover this podcast as well. To learn more about the work that we do, please go to shenomics.com. We look forward to having you tune in again for future episodes. Until then, may you be well, may you be happy, and may you be at peace.